So within the .NET framework, you have libraries underneath the namespace of system.data that facilitates database connectivity. There are classes, there are factory utility classes, there are interfaces, and there's additional kind of utility classes for data management that all exist underneath system.data. Within that namespace comes kind of pre-stock with the .NET framework is a connector for SQL Server, a connector for ODBC, and a connector for OLEDB. If those last two make no sense to you, that's okay. You may run across them at some point in the future, though. They're somewhat older technologies that are still supported for a lot of stuff. So within your application, within your project, if you're utilizing a SQL database, which most of you should be, at least within the parameters of the project, you need to work to build those mechanics in and build a local database or a local DB. Local DB is something that was created by Microsoft within this newest release of SQL Server 2012. So you do need SQL Server 2012 on whatever your development machine is in order to get local DB to work correctly. Normally when you install Visual Studio's 2012 or 2013, it comes along for the ride by default. That doesn't mean that it is there, but it should have if you took the standard install. If not, you can just Google SQL Server Express, download and install that, and just make sure it includes local DB. All right. Now, to create a database within Visual Studio, you can go in, and these are kind of my steps. This is the way that I tend to approach it. Is I'll start by adding a new folder, and I'm going to call this app_data. And the reason I choose that name is it's actually by convention, and it's a convention that Microsoft follows throughout a lot of the .NET development. If you're familiar at all with ASP.NET, you tend to see this as a stock. This is a folder that just gets created by default. But adding it to a WinForms application gets you the same net effect. And what we can do from here is with this app data folder is we can say add new item. And we can actually create a database file right inside of this folder. And since this is a specialized folder name, putting the database in here makes it so that our connection string to this database is dynamic. So no matter where on your computer it lives, no matter if you are running it off of a thumb drive, off a shared space, anywhere, it's always relative to that app_data folder. So that's kind of nice. If you don't follow that convention, then you're left to managing those connection strings every time you load and unload or move this app anywhere. All right, so under Add New Item, you choose SQL Server, Data. And then what you'll want to choose is a service-based database. And the reason you know the right type of option has been selected is because it'll say down under name, it'll say database1.mdf. So MDF is the data file for SQL Server. If it says SDF, then what you've selected is SQL Server Compact Edition. It's a completely different file, and you do not want to use an SDF. So I'm going to call this my database.mdf. And I'm going to hit add. And what SQL Server is going to do is it's going to generate that MDF file, put it inside of our app data folder, generates an LDF file, which is the log file for SQL Server. So you have your data in your log. SQL's transactional. So that means that you can commit or write changes to the database, and until they're committed, you have the ability to roll those changes back. So we now have a database called My Database. The database itself is completely empty. There's no tables, there's no data, there's nothing inside of it. It's just the shell of a database. So the same as if you would go into SQL Server Management Studio, you'd connect to a SQL Server, you create a new database, you end up with an empty database file. Now, within your project, you'll have an app config. Has anybody ever worked with the app config before? Or a web config? Okay. So the app config and the web config is an XML document that is standard across the .NET framework. And what it does is it allows you to put connection strings, application settings, and a lot of the tweaks and manipulations that you can do to your .NET app all live within these config files. So our connection string in this case will be housing it inside of our app config. So this config file is pretty bare. There are more complex ones, but for what we're going to do here, we're going to get the area called connections, or connection strings, and then we're going to add a new connection. And we'll just call this my database. Now this is the name of the string, so when we refer to it in our code, this is the name that we'll use to refer to it. So it's kind of like a reference point. Then the next property that we'll use is the connection string property. And we'll set that equal to a string, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then the provider name is the last piece, and this will be system.data.sql. Okay. So the connection string is really the meat of it. If we were connecting to a full SQL server, we would put in things like data source equals the name of the server, semicolon, database name, the name of the database on that server, and then username and password. Since we're using local DB, we're going to connect to a local DB instance. Now, to access a local DB, well, frankly, I don't usually remember the connection strings. Instead, I go to connectionstrings.com. It's a joke, but it's real. It's fun. Okay. So, connectionstrings.com, we scroll down. Never remember a connection string. Just go to connectionstrings.com. Seriously. Unless you do it every day, then they may get ingrained in your head. But they've got just about every connection string option you can think of here. So I clicked on SQL Server. We have standard security, trusted connection, connection to a SQL Server instance, enabling Mars. So here is local DB automatic instance, local DB automatic instance with a specified file name, a local DB named instance, and so forth. So what I want to use is local DB automatic instance with a specified data file, because I want to point it to the data file that I just created. So I'm going to copy this, paste it in here, clean this up a little bit. And let's kind of talk through what we have here. Blow this up so it's a little easier to read. So server, that's the server we're connecting to. Remember, SQL Server is a service-based architecture, so traditionally you're connecting to some other server to access SQL Server. In this case, we're connecting to local DB on this machine. The parentheses are important, /v11.0. This points to the local default instance of local DB. On every one of your connection strings, this will be the server that you connect to. Integrated security equals true. What that basically means is that it connects to local DB using the user that's running, that's logged in on the computer currently. So whether it's your personal machine, it's a UC machine, whatever machine it is, it's going to use your current credentials to connect to local DB. And that's perfectly fine. The attached DB file name, so this is where we change it to point it to our file. So this example says c/myfolder/mydata.mdf. If we were to go into the Solution Explorer, right-click on the App Data folder, and browse, that's where my database.mdf lives. C/user/gantos/k/document/Visual Studio 2013/project/cp week7/cp week7/appdata. If I move the project to another folder, I have to change that whole path again. Instead, I can use a relative path and a replaceable token. So instead of doing all the pathing, assuming that your MDF file is in the app_data folder, you can do pipe data directory pipe slash, and my file is called my database.mdf. Simple as that. Okay? This is inside the app.config. So I created an area called connection strings, and then I added a new connection string. Okay?
You added the data set or the database. Did you make it a data set or a data model?
I actually chose neither. I chose a new item. I chose the service-based database.
Right, I clicked that, and this thing comes up, the wizard comes up and asks me if I want to create a data set.
Okay, if you did get a wizard when you added the service-based database, just close it. Yeah, because what it's going to try to do is it tries to create this abstraction layer over top of it, either doing a data set or a data model, and we're going to actually connect to the database directly.
So with the data set, that push says go when you run the application, it goes to the database and pulls up all the information you say you want to pull in the application, correct?
Yeah, so it doesn't do it on startup, but basically the idea is just that you create this kind of in-memory version of the database, and you say, go select from this table, and it takes all that data from the database and loads it into memory, into that data set or data table. It's a memory resident version. So, what?
Which is a horrible idea.
Well, it works well if you're running either an offline mode or if you're just needing to hit and pull data all the time.
Right.
It works well for that. But then you become out of sync with the actual database. So it kind of gives you this caching capability, so you're not constantly hitting the database if you need to pull 1,000 records and you need a lookup.
Right.
It's actually more efficient to hit the database once, pull all 1,000 records, and store them in memory.
Right.
But it is, in terms of consistency and making sure that you have continuity in your data, so if someone else comes in and writes updates, you are out of sync then.
If you were to do it that way, you were updating data, when would it be committed?
And not until you call it. So you actually have to, there's a save changes that you have to call on a data set, which causes it to commit, or no, it's accept changes, I'm sorry. Accept changes pushes all the changes back to the database. And then you have to deal with collisions. So, it's just not good. Yes, I agree. So, so that's establishing that database connection, connection string and connecting to the database itself.